I'm not good at solemnity. I don't remember what we were talking about when Ander said this, whether he was prompted or whether he was interjecting. But I noted it, and not long after the context fell away, I remembered it. It struck me then, as it strikes me now, as a measure of Ander in his self-regard, or rather, his refusal to see himself or anyone, frankly, on grand terms. Cosmic and ethereal terms, maybe, but we'll get to those in a minute. I, on the other hand, am very good at solemnity, and have no trouble introducing Ander Monson to you in the grandest terms possible. What makes Ander such a powerful writer is his ability to bring meaning from the ephemera of the world. Ephemera is a word I learned and fell in love with when I paid a visit to the Stanford archives, a word that specifically refers to those items that refuse catalog. For example, a 1978 flyer passed out on a street corner in the Castro promoting a gay club that no longer exists, or expired student IDs, or reminder posters for elementary school social etiquette enrichment. I say please and thank you. This is on my door. It was a gift from someone. An archivist recognizes the worth in these items, what they can say about the people who created and used them, if not the communities in which they circulate. Ander is that kind of writer, an archivist. The rest of us, for the most part, are catalogers, maybe naively content upon containing knowledge, narrowing our focus in order to give it order. But Ander goes the opposite direction. He invites a certain chaos to his work, testing his readers' skepticism over the potential depth of subjects like Doritos and all manner of tasty snacks, or a seemingly innocuous YouTube clip of college kids in an a cappella group, or a gigantic ball of paint in the Midwest. But in each of these cases, readers find themselves astonished as Ander leads them through the multiplicity of meanings inherent in just about anything the world can produce. He leads us through these investigations with an accuracy of metaphor that can be unsettling in how it exposes our finite natures, our smallness, our not long for this worldness, indeed our ephemeral existence in the wonder of the world's constant renewal of itself. It's no surprise then that Ander often approaches his subjects with a certain humor and even disregard, as if he knows that upon investigation, he will find that his subject will, yet again, confirm something about the nature of being that he himself may not want to face. Quote, "My instinct is to laugh, but I cannot," he writes, in an essay describing a woman earnestly singing a karaoke version of Wind Beneath My Wings. I can be irreverent. This irreverence implies a kind of recognition, though, that the subject at hand does have a potential gravity that I have no access to. And so he gets to work, looking and regarding, dissecting and reordering, putting the ephemera of the world, a karaoke song sung by a woman maybe no one will remember, in greater, if not solemn, context. Quote, "Now I know that everything is a body," he writes in his poem Detail of My Sort of Light. So even the snow in the sand and the blood rivered down in the snow and snowed on again so it's buried is a body. Ander Monson is the author most recently of The Available World, a book of poems, and Vanishing Point, Not a Memoir, which was a finalist this year for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism. And he's a recipient of Grey Wolf Press's prestigious nonfiction prize. His other awards include recognition from the Christopher Isherwood Foundation and Brown University's Howard Fellowship, as well as being a 2006 finalist for the New York Public Library's Young Lions Award, which honors America's best work by writers under the age of 35. He currently is an assistant professor in our creative writing program and we are proud to have as a colleague, Ander Monson.
Thanks. And thank you all for coming out. Can you hear me? There we go. And thanks, Manuel, for that fabulous introduction, which sums things up fairly well, I think. Okay, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about labyrinths. In particular, the fellowship I received from the Howard Foundation is for ongoing work on a novel and website that's about labyrinths. It's certainly labyrinthine. And this is not really going to talk about that, but it's one of the things that prompted my thinking about labyrinths. So, good. I even made note cards. I feel very proud of myself. This is going to be the most organized talk ever. So let's start with the story, which, like most myths, is a little bit crazy, and you probably already know it. So King Minos owns a bull that he was given by Poseidon. Poseidon, gave him this fantastic bull, expecting that he would sacrifice it, but Minos can't bring himself to sacrifice the bull. He sacrifices another bull instead. Poseidon is not happy, and Poseidon makes his wife, Pasiphae, fall in love with the bull. Pasiphae commissions Daedalus, who's sort of our hero of our story and the maker of the labyrinth, among many other things, to create a mechanism that will allow her to mate with the bull, a sort of like fake bull that she can wear. And you can see, it's already kind of a crazy story. So he does, because he is nothing if not a master craftsman. That's what Daedalus does. That's what he's known for. He's a technician. So she mates with the bull. She gets pregnant. She gives birth to this deformed creature called the Minotaur. Of course, Minos is not happy about the situation. So he commissions Daedalus, sort of forces Daedalus. Then there's a bunch of different versions of the story, but he commissions Daedalus to create a labyrinth in which the Minotaur is secreted away and which is more or less impenetrable. Then there's the story of Theseus shows up, and he shows up as he's going to be sacrificed, along with a bunch of other young men and women, except that he sort of falls in love with Ariadne, who gives him a red thread that he can use to get out of the labyrinth, which he kills the Minotaur, gets out of the labyrinth, absconds with Ariadne, leaves her on an island. Things don't go that well for her. And then we sort of forget about Theseus. So at this point, Daedalus and Icarus is Daedalus' son, are imprisoned in the labyrinth by Minos, who's not happy. And so they're there. Daedalus creates this set of wings for his son, and this is probably the most famous part of the story. Creates this set of wings for his son, and for him, the two of them escape on wings. The first sort of human flight, a myth that has oddly been actually realized this century, which perhaps explains part of why we still care about this myth. Except that Icarus tempts fate, goes too high, mocks the sun, dies into the water. Daedalus survives and goes on. So, in spite of that, or perhaps because of that, the labyrinth remains a powerful symbol. No, not that kind of symbol. Though the at symbol, the ape tail, the monkey tail, the commercial at, the miyuku miyaku, as they call it in Finnish, which means cat, the kiochula, which means snail in Italian. The at symbol is surprisingly similar to the labyrinth. And that convergence, to me, is going to be the thing that sort of drives this talk to some extent. We live in the age of the at. We are added. We have, my email is ander@email.arizona.edu. Much of our reading has become digital. Much of our lives are aided and abetted by digital devices. And sometimes, sometimes they're not. But I think, especially for a younger generation, it feels oftentimes like we are, one of my handles, I should say, my online name is Ander Monson, which is my wrestling name, at Twitter. So you can find me on Twitter in that way. And we'll come back to the at a little bit. So, My obsession begins in Florida. This is a couple of years ago when my wife and I were staying at a place called Atlantic Center for the Arts, which is loosely close to Daytona Beach in Florida. And it's a writers' colony sort of thing. They bring together, musicians and writers and artists and so on who hang out and hopefully cross-pollinate and write interesting things. And I've stayed in the writers' cabin. And one of the things that was fascinating to me about the writers' cabin is that we have, as you can see here, on one of the closets, all the writers who have stayed there had signed their names and usually put dates. So it's really pretty fabulous. And you can sort of find your own. You got Ferlinghetti up top, which, that's pretty awesome. Not to mention Carolyn Forcé. I mean, and I've got dozens and dozens of these. I had to photograph these because I thought they were just so fascinating, perhaps revealing some secret of the Atlantic Center for the Arts. But I don't really care in a certain sense. So while I'm at the Atlantic Center for the Arts, here's some more for you so you can think about this. While I'm at there, I find myself, they don't have the internet. They don't have television. All they have is a VHS sort of player. They get a VCR, which to me is like, a VCR, that's it? And we had Conan the Barbarian, was the only tape we had, which we could only watch once. It's kind of great, but it's not very good. And so I started spending time, I was there to teach creative nonfiction to teens. This is sort of a teen workshop that I'm sort of involved in. So I started spending time in the library. And it's just a very small library. But in a lot of ways, I discovered this book. And it's called Testament of Daedalus by British artist Michael Ayrton. Michael Ayrton, really, really interesting guy. He died the year that I was born, 1975. So obviously we didn't really overlap. But he's a British polymath. He was a sculptor, very well known as a sculptor, very well known as a painter, as a drawer. He did a ton of scene and costume design for the theater. He worked as a BBC broadcaster. Really interesting life. And of course, he's also a novelist. And he's obsessed with Daedalus and Icarus. And to some extent, a lot of mythology. But this is sort of the crucial amount of mythology that he's interested in. We'll come back to plenty more Michael Ayrton. Here's one of his paintings, which I hope you can see it pretty well without the light on it. And thank you. That's even better. That's much better. Thank you. I think what's interesting about this is both that it suggests one of the originations of the labyrinth, which is the idea of the intestinal tract, the digestive system, in the many sort of capillaries. Like the human body is, to my mind, obviously the original source for this, which is nothing if not serpentine. So he writes this book, Testament of Daedalus, which is just a short novel, and it's out of print. You can find it. And it's a really pretty spectacular short novel, very short novel, probably like a novella. But it's about sort of recasting this Icarus Daedalus myth that I'd written a couple poems about before, because I don't know why I was fascinated by it. It's not that impressive of a myth. It's not obscure. It doesn't have hipster cred. It's not really all that interestingly intellectual. But we don't get to choose the things that we're obsessed with, I think, as writers. We can try to control that to some extent. So I discovered this book, and we'll come back to Michael Ayrton in a little bit. This is going to be a digressive talk is sort of my goal for it. So I need to tell you a little bit about some options for the labyrinth. This is, as you can see, it's a hedge maze. First, there's a difference between, though in ancient times there was not, 20th century, when we say labyrinth, what we mean is you can't make any wrong decisions. A labyrinth is something there's only one way in. You don't get to go left or right. You just follow the path and you get to the center, whatever the center is. A maze is something where you can go right, you can go left, you can get lost in a maze. And in antiquity, there wasn't really a distinction between the two. And I'm going to pretend like there's not a distinction between the two here, because I like the word labyrinth better, which sounds much more mazy, frankly, than maze does. It sounds like you could get lost in it, twists and turns, polysyllabic, a nice little sound. But when I say labyrinth, I mean maze to some extent. So there's a couple different kinds of labyrinths. This is the classical or the Cretan labyrinth. It's about, as you can see, about 400 before the Common Era, or before that. It's known as the Cretan labyrinth because they found this labyrinth sort of inscribed on coins in Crete, though it's clear the Cretans did not come up with this. But this is, they're sort of perhaps most famously identified with the Minoan civilization on Crete, which is where I was this summer, and we'll come back there in a little while also. There's also the Roman labyrinth, a little bit later, tend to be square, it's also unicursal, which is, you can kind of see, there's like only the one path, really. There's not options of getting lost in most of these. You wind around, and then you eventually end up at the center, and there's something at the center. There's the medieval, and this particular one you may recognize, and we'll return to that also. The medieval labyrinth, they tend to be in churches. This particular one is from Chartres in France, and it's when they move all the chairs off the floor of the cathedral, this is what you'll see. Okay, so I'm going to pause for a second here. To kind of get back up to speed with my cards that I'm not really using, evidently. I want to talk a little bit about where my interests in the labyrinth come from. I'm a fiction writer and a nonfiction writer and a poet, but I'm a writer, as I sort of prefer to say. I wrote this novel. I'm from Upper Michigan, which is very far north in Michigan. There's a lot of snow. We spend most of the time growing up in a place like that. You end up feeling like there's no way out. And so I discovered computer hackery, phone phreaking, essentially tapping into telephone lines as a way of connecting to the outside world. This is, of course, pre-internet and pre-web and anything like that. And so once I started to think about the labyrinth and like what the labyrinth meant to me and where I sort of found it, all of a sudden, all these things that I was previously obsessed with, say this is a circuit board for a ham radio. If you want to make your own ham sort of amateur radio, you can use this to make a board that'll do something. And so I wrote my first novel, and it has a whole bunch of these circuit diagrams in it, which is odd. I mean, I wasn't really thinking about the labyrinth, but this is extremely labyrinthy, like when I look at it now. My job here is primarily teaching nonfiction. And I think of, as Manuel sort of alluded to, a lot of what I think about, I teach the essay, I write the essay, and in a way this talk is a kind of extemporaneous essay. Or hopefully, maybe it's not very good, but we'll find that out later. A lot of what nonfiction is that we start with the world and we pick things out, delete the rest so that the things that are left connect to each other, sort of perhaps in the ways that things connect on a circuit board. There's a great David Foster Wallace quote about the difference between fiction and nonfiction, and this is from a writerly point of view, not from a readerly point of view. As a writer, and I think I mostly believe this, David Foster Wallace, who's one of our illustrious alums of the MFA program in which Manuel and I teach, he says that the difference between fiction and nonfiction is that they come from different places and they fail in different ways. Fiction comes from silence. It's nothing, it comes from nothing, it is summoned up, and if it fails back into silence. Nonfiction comes from infinity, the world. As a nonfiction writer, that's what we have. We have the world. We have every single thing available to us. And our job is to take those things and delete the things that don't mean anything until what's remaining means something. So if it fails back into total noise. So it starts with everything, you winnow down, and if it fails, if it doesn't mean anything, that's because there's still too much there. And David Foster Wallace is, of course, a well-known fiction writer and nonfiction writer, although I'm partial to his nonfiction, perhaps for this. So, another option, another way into our labyrinth of a talk, the mind. This is the central metaphor of my work, I think. I'm from Upper Michigan, and it's the copper country. We have copper and iron ore. This is the central tragedy of Upper Michigan, is the exploitation of both the earth and of the people, including my great-great-grandfather who worked in the mine. And like many people who worked in the mine, died young for obvious reasons, sort of mainly a lot of bronchial problems. So this is the Quincy Mine and Hoist, which is very close to where I live in Upper Michigan. And it's a diagram of it, as you can see. The experience of growing up where I grew up is one of you come on a hole in the earth. Sometimes the mines, all the mine shafts, they've been covered up or they've been occasionally caved in or blocked off. They put one of the things they do is they put a bunch of sort of like chicken wire over it so that bats, because there's a million bats, millions and millions of bats that live in the mines, and they come out, and then so like there's raccoons over the chicken wire, and they just like swipe bats as they come by, which is good news for the raccoons, but sad news for the bats. And so the experience of being a sort of adolescent in Upper Michigan is you come on holes in the ground, and what are you going to do? Well, you're going to try to go into the hole in the ground and see what's in the hole in the ground. And it's a bad idea for, a lot of reasons. But where I'm from, there's not a lot of good ideas. So this is one of the least bad of them, perhaps. Another option is the dungeon, which is not that dissimilar from the mine. This is a very early experience of mine. I'm going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons for a few minutes. I grew up playing Dungeons & Dragons, and sort of in the era where it was like one of the things that was sort of satanic and that was bad, and which of course made it cool. It sort of gave this luster to it. What Dungeons & Dragons is, I've got a few notes here, which I'll let you know about. Starts about 1972. Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson published the rules of Dungeons & Dragons. And all it really is, it's just a system for collaborative storytelling. And playing D&D, as some of you probably played D&D or something like D&D. If you grew up more or less in my generation, you probably at least had some sense of what it's like. It's just sitting around in the kitchen or some basement, in my case, the basement of my parents' duplex, telling stories or working in this one collaborative story where people are role-playing characters and they kind of move through it. And they have graphics like this. I have hundreds and hundreds of dungeons that I would draw. And you sort of, there'd be traps and there'd be other kinds of interesting things. So this is my actual kitchen table now. These are my actual miniatures that I have still from my days as a Dungeons & Dragons player. What you might know about Dungeons & Dragons is based on the 1982 movie, which is a really bad movie called Mazes and Monsters, which is actually an early Tom Hanks movie. And it was based on a really, really awful novel by Rona Jaffe from 1980, which in turn was based on an actual story. One of the, probably, I think he was 15, 16. His name was Dallas Egbert III. And he was just a sort of genius, messed up kid, going to Michigan State University, played Dungeons & Dragons, evidently, and then also did a bunch of other things, did a lot of drugs, and was part of the SCA, the Society for Creative Anachronism, the people who, sort of like do the battles out there with the swords and their homemade chainmail. And so he disappears into the steam tunnels underneath Michigan State University. There's another labyrinth for us. And he disappears, his parents freak out, everyone tries to find him, they can't find him. And his uncle hires a private investigator who then tries to track him down and comes up with this elaborate theory all about how probably he confused reality with Dungeons & Dragons and got lost in the steam tunnels playing real life Dungeons & Dragons. And eventually they find him. He just disappeared. He freaked out and disappeared, and then later committed suicide. But they find him, and Dungeons & Dragons has nothing at all to do with this story, but he publishes this book based on it. It starts this media firestorm about how Dungeons & Dragons, this is also kind of in the era of, we all sort of assumed, the culture assumed that there was satanic things going on everywhere, and repressed memories and all this sort of craziness. So Dungeons & Dragons gets this reputation and is vilified as sort of the reason which drove this poor kid insane. Never mind that it didn't really happen that way. Rona Jaffe writes this really bad book that sort of just butchers the whole thing and then gets turned into this movie, and then bam, Dungeons & Dragons is bad and evil, which also makes it cool. And then, of course, TSR, Tactical Studies Rules, who made Dungeons & Dragons, also sells the hell out of Dungeons & Dragons once it becomes a sort of bad thing. So it's easy to see, especially as a sort of maladjusted teenage kid from Upper Michigan who's interested in computers and phones, that this is a labyrinth you can get pretty easily lost in very, very quickly. And this is a particularly elaborate dungeon that you can go through. From there, of course, I move into computer games. This is a game called Rogue, which is a version of Hack, which is a version of NetHack, and there's a bunch of other versions. One of the interesting things about Rogue is you see the symbol up there, the little yellow symbol, is an @ symbol. That is the symbol for our character. And you just a guy or whatever, a girl, it doesn't really matter. I think you have a name. I named myself, I don't know if it has my name here. No, that's probably for the best. Because I think I named him Paul. And so it's just a game where pretty rudimentary graphics. You just wander through little randomly created dungeons. Again, from place to place, you kill the kestrel, you hit Q to quaff a potion, and it goes on from there. And here, wait, no, come back. Are we not going to get the video? Oh, that's going to be very sad. Oh, wait, there we go. And this is much later, but not really all that different in gameplay to playing this game Rogue. This is a game called Fallout New Vegas. And all it is, pretty much anyone that's grown up playing video games of any sort, is all you do is you wander through dungeons, whether we call them dungeons or not, whether we call them labyrinths or not, except now you have guns instead of swords, and you still kill monsters. There's a whole generation that grows up with this idea that this is what you do. And it really defines, I think, a lot. It starts to define a lot of the ways we think about both games and the way in which games have started to take over life, in that we accrue points, we gather treasure, we get frequent flyer miles, we have Weight Watchers points. We've become gamified. People are trying to incentivize us to do things that are good for us. And then we level up. There's a lot of leveling up. I have this Nike Plus that you put it in your shoe and it tells you how long you've been. It tells you how long you've run and how many miles. And I'm on the violet level now. And I'm going to eventually get up to being like the blue level once I get over 2,000 miles. And then I can feel really good about myself for no reason. But again, there's something very primal for me about this experience. It's both the experience of kind of going through, just wandering through contained places, looking around, but it's very sort of appealing, and it's begun to mean something to me. We don't have to watch the whole video; it goes on for a while. I kill a lot of things, and it's really cool when that happens. But I think that we live now, though, in the age of the at. We live certainly in the age of the GPS. I've got a GPS in my car. And it overlays everything, it tells me where things are when I'm kind of moving around. Occasionally it'll make me do an illegal U-turn, which is not good. But I think we live in the age of being found. It's very hard to stay away from things. People have Google alerts set up for their names. People are sharing, photos, et cetera, on Twitter. We live in the age of great muchness, and everything is out there. So perhaps it's no surprise that some of us want to feel a little bit more lost. The act of essaying is about both mapping, and it's not always mapping, but to me it's very much about mapping self in the world, going out in the world, finding things, bringing them back, which is a kind of game feature in a way. You go find cool stuff, you bring them back, and then you have them talk to each other. But the act of essaying is very much about finding and gathering, and hunting, I suppose, too, in that sense. Hence, there's been a bunch of really interesting books that have been atlases published in the last year. There's a book called Dennis Wood's Everything Sings, Maps for a Narrative Atlas, in which he takes a whole bunch of his students from, I think, the late 70s, early 80s, and they just map this one neighborhood that he lives in, Boylan Heights, in North Carolina. And they're maps of, you can follow this sort of timeline of the paperboy moving around, or the relative amount of sort of light spillage from windows. They're really, really interesting maps. And there's one by Judith Shalansky, who's a German writer and designer, called, which I wrote down, Atlas of Remote Islands, which is a fantastic book if you like maps at all. All it is maps and sort of brief 500-word kind of histories of actual islands, remote islands that most of us will have never gone to. But we live in a world now where I think the assumption is that things are knowable. There aren't very many blank spaces on the map. We assume that we can find our way to things, that we can get the coordinates of anything, and we can use Google Street View to sort of learn something about that, which is both a great thing. As a technologist, I love this, but it's also a kind of sadness that there is an appeal in being lost and losing ourselves. So the appeal of getting lost is in fact very appealing. In 1996, Lauren Chartres publishes a book called Walking a Sacred Path. And this is probably where, if you have any sense of the Contemporary Labyrinth, you have a sense of how this works, where she is arguing for the labyrinth essentially as a meditation tool. And she goes, among other things, to Chartres and to walk the floor. And she's making a case for it. It's a little bit New Agey and a little bit Christian, and it doesn't really matter in a certain sense. But she's arguing for you go to the labyrinth with a problem or perhaps with nothing, and you walk the thing, and in so doing, in sort of like that, it's just like a rote action, follow the path, take a right, turn to the left, follow the path. You walk slowly, and it allows you to meditate on whatever it is that you were interested in thinking about or whatever you bring to the table, and you'll have some kind of breakthrough perhaps, or perhaps not. So this summer, as part of this grant that I got, this Howard Foundation Fellowship, I went to a couple of the sites of labyrinths, including the one at Chartres, which is, I think, kind of an amazing experience. And maybe more interestingly, the one at the Palace of Knossos in Crete. And this is the ruins of the original palace that the stories about Icarus and Daedalus are allegedly from. You could see I don't know, there's no labyrinth extant there. What there is there's a lot of ruins, some of which have been restored variously, accurately or not. But you could see it's at the least a very labyrinthine structure. But it's an interesting experience because they've rebuilt a lot of things in the way that this guy, Arthur Evans, who discovered it, he's also kind of a colonialist, and he sort of remade this culture in his image. And there's a couple of books about this that are pretty interesting and kind of make various arguments about this. So some of it is actual old, like real ruins, and some of it is reconstructed ruins. And like this thing here, which is beautiful, but probably has nothing really to do with what was there. Or it probably has something to do with it, but it's informed very much by the eyes, the vision that is, that's actually looking at this and trying to figure out, and he presupposed this Minoan culture as a sort of matriarchal culture, which it may or may not have been. And so the experience of going to this, to see the original labyrinth is one of frustration, because I thought, I was sort of hoping it would be like an actual labyrinth that I could go explore, but it's not. And it's also just being another tourist at another tourist destination, where you're packed in a van and you're just there for a while and it's hot and it's kind of unpleasant. I thought I might experience kind of a spiritual awakening, but I didn't get that. So here's a more interesting labyrinth. And here we're going to return to the question, this is Arkville, New York, which is up in the Catskills. In 1968, our friend Michael Ayrton publishes this novel called The Maze Maker, which is a long sort of exploration. Daedalus is the main character, and it just follows Daedalus through a number of these stories from antiquity. And it's a pretty phenomenal novel. I think it's actually great. I don't think it's quite as good as the Testament of Daedalus, which has the virtue of brevity. But Ayrton, as someone who worked in bronze and worked in many different media, identifies very strongly with Daedalus, because Daedalus is a maker. He makes stuff. That's his genius. He can make better stuff than anyone else, make better toys. So he publishes this novel, The Maze Maker. It's a big hit in Europe, comes over to America. It's a big hit here. And this millionaire investment banker named Armand Erpf, who lives in New York and has this property in the Catskills, says, he finds him in a book tour. He says, "Well, will you make me one?" And of course, Michael Ayrton, he's like, of course, it'll cost a lot of money. But the prospect of making a life-size, I think it's about 170 feet wide, labyrinth of stone is exceedingly exciting for him. As it would be to anyone whose job is to make things. He also makes a couple other really interesting things. And so this is the property in the Catskills that you can sort of see. The labyrinth is right here. You can't. Google Maps won't give me any closer images. Anyway, Armand Erpf dies later, and perhaps as a result of that, his widow, who's ailing, doesn't allow anyone on their property. So this is about as close as we're going to get. I have some other photos of it. So I spent some time up there trying to get access to this labyrinth, because of course that's the thing I want most in the world now, is to get access to this labyrinth and find out more about this story. And some of it has been chronicled. This is a model for the labyrinth. It's not the actual thing, but a model that he made, which is in some gallery somewhere. It's the only stone maze built since the 4th century, before the Common Era. 3 years ago, And here's an image of the labyrinth. It's quite beautiful. 3 years ago, in 2008, a woman died in the labyrinth. That they were, apparently the Earps would allow, to some extent, they would allow people to come in and wander the labyrinth if you called ahead. That changed because people would sneak in at night. People would get drunk mostly. This actually sounds very Upper Michigan-y. You'd get drunk and then do something stupid. And so that's what people did. This woman came in, she and her party got drunk and wandered in around the labyrinth. And it's not easy to get to, so they had to cross a couple of rivers and climb a tree or something to get there. So she falls off, cracks her skull, and dies. As a result, the labyrinth is now totally closed. They do not let anyone in. It was hard to get access before, but now it's really, really hard to get access to. Here's another shot of the labyrinth. Go through a couple of them here. And that's my favorite. This has got 6 foot to 8 foot high walls. And it's really, technically, it's a maze, because there are opportunities to get lost in here. It's pretty hard to negotiate, as you can see if we look back at our little map here. It's not easy to find your way in, but it's on this reclusive millionaire's property in the middle of the Catskills. And what's in the center? Well, we have the Minotaur, of course. And this is not in the center of the maze. He cast 2 of them. And this is in England, someplace. So we'll kind of zoom out here for a moment. A lot of what we do now seems to me essentially labyrinthine. What do we do on the internet? Except for we click on one thing, then we click on another 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 thing, and we sort of wind through. It would be really, to look at the sort of like our browser histories and the thing that led us to here, 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 would be fascinating to look at, but it's actually kind of hard to do. So you could see here, this is just like some of the websites I consult every day. I spend a lot of time online. I've been trying to work with this new book, The Vanishing Point, try to work with things that are it's a combination of a website and a book. So you can see words in the book and then go to the website for more information and so on. So how do we get out of the labyrinth? One is actually in exploring things. And this is something I've been doing a lot of lately, is spending time in the Tucson storm sewers, especially the one in the Rio River where it hits Campbell. There's a storm sewer you can access, which goes in for about 3 miles. And it's a pretty fabulous experience. It's pretty clean. Don't go during the monsoon. That would be a really, really bad idea. But I spent a lot of time in the storm sewers. I'm skipping ahead. Not that far. But the sewers are certainly a kind of labyrinth. And in here you see on the walls, I've cataloged almost all the graffiti on the walls, and clearly kind of a labyrinth. And we bury what we fear underground in dungeons. Part of the experience of being underground in the storm sewers, if you haven't experienced it, Tucson is such a city, you could hear the traffic kind of going on. And some of the manholes that they cross are actually extremely loud. And I've got a lot of video of that kind of thing happening. But the experience of Tucson is so much, it's like a surface city. All you would do is try to stay away from the sun as best we can. And being underground, it doesn't take very long before you really start to think about, is this the real world that we're in? Or what happens if you go in underground Tucson? There's so few storm sewers here too, say compared to Michigan, because there's, it's kind of hard to dig them. We don't get as much rain, but really interesting. And if you're interested in the storm sewers, a couple professors, Ellen McMahon, an art professor, and Beth Weinstein, an architecture professor, and I are going to be doing a show with some of their grad students at UA Downtown, this new space down there, which opens, I think, probably this weekend or early next week. And I did an installation of mechanical singing fish, the billy basses that sing "Take Me to the River." Well, I did an installation in the storm sewers of these. So there'll be a video, and I've got about 40 mechanical animatronic things that sing, and they make a pretty great sound. So you can come down and check that out if you're interested. I also have a lot of video of this. Another option, there's a lot of labyrinths around here. Not to mention the mines, which are all over the place. Arizona is not. It's also the copper country down here, which is just like where I'm from in Upper Michigan. But here's one up at St. Pious, which is on the northeast side. One at the Emmanuel Presbyterian. And this is a sort of traditional meditative labyrinth. Pretty much all the labyrinths in town are on church property. The St. Pious one is a reproduction of the one at Chartres. Who built it? I don't know. That's a good question. I find myself more fond of the ones that are clearly homemade in a way. I mean, the other ones are sort of concrete painted on. But it's a very lovely space. It's sort of off, it's about, I think, around the 10,000 block on 22nd on the east side. And you can go in and walk the labyrinth and take your time. And really, if you want, the experience of the labyrinth is one best done alone, preferably where no one else is there, and you can spend your time meditating and thinking and just being silent, which I'm not very good at. Partially may explain why I don't always get what I'm expected to get out of the labyrinth. And this goes on for a while too, so we'll skip that. There's the other Southwest variant, which is the Man in the Maze, which is the Tohono O'odham, and is represented a lot of times on baskets, Hopi baskets and Navajo baskets and so on, which is pretty fascinating also. It's not just something that came out of the Mediterranean. The labyrinth has been around in pretty much every culture worldwide has some version of the labyrinth from antiquity. And the Man in the Maze, I think, is maybe one of the most fascinating and beautiful looking. There's a really great one you can go up to at Udall Park. And this is, the Man in the Maze is a cosmology, just like most of these other labyrinths are. That you start at birth at the top, and you move down slowly. And you can see this is a basket that has it's a metal reproduction of a basket. You move down slowly through that labyrinth until you arrive at death, or whatever sort of cosmic encounter one wants. And there's one just outside the Udall Park Rec Center, which you can take a look at. And again, it's fascinating once you start to think about the labyrinth, how much it begins to invade the rest of your thinking. Another reason why, presumably, it's so widespread. So there's some question of whether the labyrinth is meant to keep things out, to protect, say, the Minotaur, or is it meant to keep something inside? And ultimately what I've found is that the labyrinth, partially because it is such a personal experience and it can be a very intense experience that relates to whatever is going on in your life or your reading or your writing or your thinking, is that the best way to experience the labyrinth is to go out there and find one for yourself, of which there are many. You can go to labyrinthos.net, is a website that catalogs a lot of the different labyrinths. And there's probably, 10 or 15 within about an hour drive, I would say, of here, not including mine shafts, not including the storm sewers, not including the sort of more dangerous labyrinths. And as an English professor, I feel obliged to put the little, we need an apostrophe there. Like the single thing that irritates me most about life. So I'd encourage you to go check out your own labyrinth and see what experience can be made of it for yourself. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.